The text came through at 0600 right as I was lacing my boots for physical training. I read it twice before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. Then I sat down on the edge of my bunk, still holding my phone, and I didn't move for a long time. My father had just uninvited me from my own sister's wedding. Not with an apology, not with an explanation. Just 11 words sent like an order he expected me to follow without question. And the worst part wasn't the message itself. It was that some part of me wasn't even surprised. I'd requested leave 3 weeks earlier. I'd bought a dress I never wear, the kind that sits in the back of a closet collecting dust between deployments and drills. I'd picked out a gift, a set of hand-blown glass vases Emily had once mentioned loving during a trip to Charleston back when we still talked about things like glassware instead of silence. I'd mapped out the drive from base, factored in traffic. Planned to leave a full day early so I could help with whatever last-minute chaos wedding week always brings. I'd done everything a sister is supposed to do. And then 6 days before the ceremony, my father decided the guest list was full. I read the message a third time, searching for some hidden softness in it, some sign that this was a mistake or a joke or a misunderstanding I could clear up with one phone call. There wasn't one. Richard Caldwell doesn't send messages by accident. He sends them the way he does everything else in his life, deliberately, with the outcome already decided before the first word is typed. I called my mother. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I didn't leave one. I texted Emily instead, just a short message, something like, "Did you know about this?" The message sat there with one gray check mark under it for the rest of the day, unanswered. I want to be honest about something. I've spent most of my adult life training myself not to feel surprised by my family. It's easier that way. When you're the daughter your father describes as difficult, because you asked why instead of just doing what you were told, you learn to keep your expectations low enough that they can't be dropped from very high. I joined the Army at 22, partly out of a genuine desire to serve, and partly, if I'm being truthful with myself, because it was the first place I'd ever been in my life where competence was rewarded instead of quietly resented. My father never understood that. To him, the uniform wasn't an achievement, it was a rejection. Every promotion I earned, every assignment I completed, felt to him like another brick in a wall I was building between myself and the family he wanted me to be part of on his terms, in his shape. When I made captain, he said, "That's your job, Madison. It's not a personality." When Emily bought her first house at 28, he called it the proudest day of his life. When I couldn't make it home for Christmas because I was stationed overseas, he told relatives I'd chosen the Army over the family. Nobody ever asked what the Army had chosen for me. Structure, discipline, a version of belonging that didn't depend on being someone's favorite. So when the text came through that morning, I did what I've trained myself to do with almost everything that hurts. I put the phone in my pocket, finished lacing my boots, and went out to formation. I didn't cry. I didn't call my father to argue. I typed one sentence back to him hours later after PT and briefings, and a full day of pretending my chest didn't feel like it had a stone sitting in it. "Understood, I won't come." He didn't respond. I hadn't expected him to. Richard Caldwell doesn't do follow-up conversations. He issues a ruling and considers the matter closed the same way a judge might dismiss a case he never intended to hear in the first place. That night, I lay in my quarters staring at the ceiling, doing the thing I always do when I can't sleep, running through logistics instead of feelings. I recalculated my leave request. I thought about canceling the dress, the gift, the drive. I told myself it didn't matter that I had a job to do, that my worth had never once depended on whether Richard Caldwell wanted me in a photograph on his daughter's wedding day. I almost believed it. Then, a little after 11, my phone rang. Emily's name lit up the screen, and for a second I let myself hope this was her calling to fix things, to tell me the text had been some kind of misunderstanding. That of course I was still coming, that this was all a mistake. I answered. Her voice came through first thin and shaking in a way I hadn't heard from my sister since we were kids. "Madison." A breath. "What did you do?" I sat up straight in the dark. "What are you talking about?" There was a pause, and then the sound of her crying, quiet and unsteady, like she was trying to hold it together and failing. "Dad just saw that photo." I gripped the phone tighter. "What photo, Emily?" She took a breath that shook on its way in. "Someone from Dad's old unit posted something on Facebook. A group photo from that ceremony you did back in the spring. You're in it, standing next to some general." For a second my mind went blank, then clicked into place. The award ceremony. Fort Belvoir, late March, cold enough that my hands had gone numb, standing at attention for the better part of an hour. I remembered shaking hands afterward, remembered General Samuel Whitmore saying a few words to me about the work my unit had done, remembered someone's phone flashing nearby. I hadn't thought about it since. It wasn't a moment I'd built into anything. It was just a Tuesday that happened to have a camera in it. Okay, I said slowly, and that's a problem because Dad's been staring at it for an hour. Emily's voice cracked. He called me the second he saw it. He wanted to know how long you'd been a major. I didn't know, Madison. I didn't know what to tell him. I sat with that for a moment, the strange, quiet humiliation of it settling into my chest. My own father didn't know my rank, not because I'd hidden it, because he'd never once asked. I wasn't hiding anything, Emily, I said. It's public information. It's on my uniform. It's been on my uniform for 2 years. I know that. But Dad said... She stopped herself, and I could hear her deciding whether to finish the sentence. Said what? He said you were trying to embarrass him, that you posed for that photo on purpose, knowing it would get back to him. I almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about it, just a kind of tired disbelief that had become familiar over the years. By standing in a photo at an official army ceremony, Emily, I didn't even know that photo existed until you called me. She was quiet for a second, then softer. He said you weren't supposed to be there. That sentence sat strangely in my ear. Not supposed to be where exactly the ceremony had been mine to attend. My work, my unit, my award. There was no version of that day where my presence required anyone's permission but the Army's. And that was when something shifted in my understanding of what was actually happening. This wasn't about a photo. My father hadn't been afraid of a picture. He'd been afraid of what the picture proved, that his daughter had built a life and a reputation entirely without him, one significant enough that men like General Whitmore knew her by name and shook her hand in public. He didn't fear the image. He feared the version of me it revealed, a version he hadn't gotten to shrink down first. Emily, I said carefully, why does it matter to Dad who I stand next to in a photograph? She didn't answer right away, and in the silence I could hear her breathing uneven like she was working up to something. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped almost like she was afraid of being overheard, even though she was alone. There's something else. A pause. Dad's been saying things to David about you. My stomach tightened. What kind of things? About Grandpa's estate. Another pause, longer this time. He told David you don't have any claim to it. I sat completely still. Outside my window, somewhere across base, a vehicle pulled into a lot, headlights sweeping briefly across the wall before the room went dark again. I turned my sister's words over in my mind, trying to find a version of them that made sense and couldn't. I didn't know I had a claim to anything, I said finally. That's what I thought too, Emily said. But the way Dad talks about it, it's like there's something specific he's trying to keep David from asking about. Something about the money. I thought about our grandfather, a quiet man who'd built a modest but respectable amount of wealth through decades of careful work, who used to slip both of us $5 bills when we were kids and tell us not to tell our parents. I thought about how after he passed, my father had simply taken over the handling of whatever remained, and how none of us, not me, not Emily, maybe not even my mother, had ever asked the kinds of questions you're supposed to ask when a family estate changes hands. Emily, I said, I think we need to find out what Dad's actually protecting. She didn't argue. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister and I were looking at the same confusing, uncomfortable puzzle from the same side. It didn't fix 6 days of being erased from her wedding. It didn't undo years of being the daughter who chose the Army over the family. But it was, for the first time in a long time, a small thread of us against something instead of me against all of them. I told her I needed to make a call in the morning. She didn't ask who to. I think somewhere underneath the fear in her voice, she already suspected I wasn't going to let this go quietly. And she was right. I wasn't angry yet, not in the way that makes people reckless. I was doing what the Army had trained into me for over a decade. I was gathering intelligence before I moved. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Emily again either, not right away. What I did instead was something quieter, something that wouldn't tip anyone off before I actually understood what I was dealing with. I found a civilian estate attorney 2 counties over from where my parents lived, someone with no connection to our family, no history with the Caldwell name, no reason to soften anything for my benefit. I didn't mention my rank when I called her office. I didn't need an advocate. I needed a reader, someone who could look at documents and tell me in plain language what they actually said. She asked me to send whatever records I had. That turned out to be almost nothing. I hadn't kept copies of my grandfather's estate paperwork because I'd never once been told I needed to. So I did what felt oddly like combat prep. I called the county recorder's office. I requested probate records, public and searchable if you know where to look. I spent 2 nights after duty hours sitting at a folding table in my quarters, with a laptop and a legal pad cross-referencing dates, account numbers, and names, feeling less like a daughter uncovering a family secret and more like an officer building a case file. What I found didn't come all at once. It came in pieces the way most uncomfortable truths do. My grandfather's will, dated 11 years earlier, named both Emily and me as equal beneficiaries of a modest trust, funded initially with proceeds from the sale of his hardware business. Equal, not favored, not divided by some formula that quietly put more weight on one granddaughter than the other. Equal in his own handwriting, in a document he'd clearly taken the time to get right. But somewhere between his death and now, a significant portion of that trust had been restructured. Moved into a newly created family fund administered not by a neutral trustee but by my father, Richard Caldwell, sole signatory. I stared at that line for a long time. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Families restructure finances, trustees change. It didn't automatically mean something was wrong. So I kept reading, kept comparing dates, and eventually found the piece that made my hands go still on the keyboard. A withdrawal made 4 years ago in an amount large enough that it wasn't a rounding error or an administrative fee. The withdrawal date lined up almost exactly with the closing date on Emily's first house. I sat with that for a while before I let myself feel anything about it. I want to be clear because it matters. I wasn't angry at Emily. Not in that moment, and honestly not really at any point after. My sister didn't forge a signature. She didn't ask our father to quietly move money that belonged partly to me in order to fund her closing costs. As far as I could tell from the records, she'd simply been told it was family money, a gift from Dad. Generosity dressed up as nothing more complicated than a father helping his daughter start her life. She had no reason to question a story that flattered her and cost her nothing. What hurt wasn't the money itself. It was the calculation underneath it. Somewhere along the way, my father had decided that whatever our grandfather intended for me could simply be redirected quietly, without my knowledge or consent. Consent because he'd already built a story in his head about who deserved a fresh start and who didn't. Emily needed help. I apparently did not. I had a paycheck. I had discipline. I had the army. In his mind, that made me self-sufficient enough not to need what was legally mine. I called my mother that night, mostly out of habit, the same instinct that makes you check a wound even when you already know it's going to hurt. She answered on the second ring, and something in her voice told me she'd been waiting for this call for longer than I realized. "Your father said you wouldn't understand," she said before I'd even finished explaining what I'd found. "Understand what, Mom?" "That he wanted to give Emily a fresh start, that's all. He didn't think of it as taking anything from you." "And me?" I asked. "What was I supposed to get?" The silence on the other end of the line answered before she did. It stretched long enough that I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bluntness that there had never been a plan for me. Not because I was owed less. Because somewhere in my father's mind, my strength had quietly been reclassified as a kind of surplus, something that meant I could simply go without. Before I let her go, I asked one more question, mostly because some instinct told me the story wasn't finished. "Is there anything else in that fund? Anything still pending?" My mother's answer came out smaller than I expected. "I don't know exactly. Your father mentioned something about finalizing things before the wedding." I went back to the documents that night and found what she was talking about almost immediately once I knew what to look for. A new transaction prepared but not yet executed, dated for a window that fell just weeks before Emily's ceremony. The amount attached to it wasn't a rounding error either. It was larger than anything that had moved before it. The wedding happened on a Saturday in early June, and I spent it exactly where my father had decided I belonged, 300 miles away, standing in for a colleague's shift, so someone with young kids could have their weekend. I didn't drink. I didn't cry into a pillow or stare at the clock counting down the hours of the ceremony I wasn't invited to. I worked. It was in its own strange way easier than sitting home with nothing to do but imagine it. I found out what was said about me secondhand the way I find out most things about my family now, through Emily days later, once she'd had time to process it herself. According to her, when a cousin asked where I was, my father answered smoothly without hesitation, the kind of practiced ease that comes from having rehearsed a lie until it feels like truth. Madison couldn't get leave, he told them. You know how the army is. A few heads nodded. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? It was a reasonable explanation delivered by a reasonable-sounding man, and none of them had any reason to know that I'd actually had my leave approved 3 weeks earlier. That I'd requested time off specifically for this day, that the only obstacle standing between me and that ceremony had been a text message from him. Emily told me later that something about the moment didn't sit right with her even before she understood why. A distant relative had pressed a little further, asking half-joking whether Madison and Dad were still not talking. My father's answer had come out sharper than the question warranted. "She's always been more interested in the army than family," he said. Emily said she remembered that sentence specifically because it was the first time in the entire day that something about her father's version of events felt performed, rather than true. She didn't say anything at the reception. She told me she smiled, accepted a toast, danced with David, and let the day carry her forward the way weddings do, on momentum and noise, and the determined effort of everyone in the room to make sure nothing goes wrong. It was David who found the folder. He wasn't looking for anything. That's the detail that matters here, the thing that made it land differently than if he'd gone digging out of suspicion. He was searching my parents' home office for a spare phone charger during the reception, ducking out for 2 minutes, while Emily was occupied with photographs, and he came across a manila folder sitting on the corner of my father's desk, half-tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail. My father's handwriting was on the tab. Estate final. David didn't open it fully. He glanced enough to see numbers that didn't look small enough to see language about a fund transfer, and a signature line still waiting to be filled. He put it back exactly where he found it, and said nothing that night. But something about it stayed with him the way certain small wrong-shaped things do, sitting uneasily at the back of your mind, until you can't ignore them anymore. 2 days after the wedding, he brought it up with my father directly. He told me later he'd kept his tone respectful, careful, framed as a simple question rather than an accusation. He asked what the transfer was, whether it involved Emily, whether there was anything he and Emily needed to understand about assets that might affect them going forward. My father's response, according to David, was immediate and cold. "This is a family matter." "It becomes my matter," David said, "when my wife's inheritance is involved." That sentence apparently ended the conversation. My father didn't answer further questions. He simply told David the matter was being handled and that he'd appreciate David staying out of it. David called me that same evening. I want to be honest about how strange that call felt at first. A man I barely knew, my sister's new husband. Someone I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, calling to tell me he thought my father was mishandling money that might partly belong to me. But there was something steady in the way he spoke. No theatrics, no agenda I could detect beyond a fairly simple discomfort with watching someone he respected be lied to by someone he was supposed to trust. "I think your father's about to transfer something that doesn't fully belong to him," he told me. I don't know all the details, but I saw enough to know it's not small. I didn't say much in response. Some old instinct in me still resisted the idea of inserting myself into Emily's marriage, into a wedding I hadn't even been allowed to attend. But I also understood, sitting there with the documents I'd already gathered, that I no longer had the luxury of staying quiet out of politeness. Whatever my father was preparing to finalize wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. 2 days later, Emily called. Her voice had none of the softness it usually carried when she talked about our father. She told me she'd found a copy of the same document David had seen left carelessly on the printer in the office, and this time she'd read it in full. She'd seen the numbers. She'd seen my grandfather's original will referenced by name. And she'd seen unmistakably my signature line still empty on a document authorizing the transfer of money that was supposed to have been mine. 3 days after the wedding, my father called a family meeting. He didn't call it that exactly. He phrased it to Emily as clearing the air before things get out of hand. Which was, I would come to understand his way of trying to control a conversation before anyone else could shape it. He asked her and David to come by Sunday afternoon. He didn't invite me. Emily did that herself without telling him, and I drove down that morning without announcing it to anyone but her. I walked into my parents' living room a little after 2, and I watched my father's face do something I'd rarely seen it do in 34 years. It faltered. Just for a second, a flicker of surprise before he rebuilt his composure into something closer to irritation. "You weren't invited," he said, "and yet somehow you're still causing problems." "I didn't cause anything," I said. I kept my voice level. I'd learned a long time ago that volume is often mistaken for strength, and that the quietest person in a room is frequently the one everyone else is straining to hear. "You always do," he said. I didn't argue the point. I set my bag down on the coffee table instead, unzipped it, and began laying out what I'd gathered one document at a time in the order that told the story most clearly. My grandfather's original will, the paperwork creating the family fund, the withdrawal that lined up with Emily's house closing, the unsigned transfer dated for a window that had already passed. I didn't raise my voice through any of it. I didn't need to. "Let's stop talking about feelings," I said, "and start talking about this." Emily picked up the first page and read it slowly, her eyes moving down the document the way people read things they're afraid to fully understand. I watched her face change as she got further in, watched the pieces she'd already half suspected settle into something she could no longer avoid. "You told me this was your money," she said, looking up at our father. "You told me it was a gift." "It was family money," he said. "That's not what you told me," Emily said, and her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard her use with him before. Not anger exactly, something closer to betrayal finding its footing. My father turned toward me instead of answering her the way he always did when a situation stopped going his way. "She's always been jealous of you," he said to Emily, nodding in my direction. "This is what this is about. Jealousy." I didn't respond to that. I'd expected it honestly, some version of an old worn accusation meant to shrink the conversation back down to something familiar and manageable. Sisters competing over their father's approval instead of a grown man mismanaging money that wasn't fully his. What I hadn't expected was Emily. "Stop blaming her," she said. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence before it. My father actually looked at her startled, like he was seeing his younger daughter clearly for the first time in years. Emily had spent her whole life being protected, praised, positioned as the easier, more agreeable Caldwell daughter. Watching her stand there, documents in hand, defending me, instead of accepting the story she'd been handed, was its own kind of reckoning, not just for him, but I think for her too. She was realizing in real time what it had cost to be the favorite. She'd never had to ask hard questions because someone had always been managing the answers for her. My father wasn't finished, though. He still had one card left, the one he always reached for when logic failed him. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than us?" he said, turning back to me, his voice rising for the first time. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. Not because I needed to think about it, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of the pause the way silence can hold more authority than a raised voice ever could. "No," I said. "It just taught me that rank doesn't matter when you're wrong." He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in my life, I watched my father sit in a room full of people who loved him and find himself with nothing left to say. Margaret stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, quiet in the particular way she'd always been quiet. But I could see something shifting in her face, too. Some old familiar guilt finally surfacing after years of staying underwater. David didn't say much. He didn't need to. He'd already done his part simply by asking the question that started all of this, by refusing to let family matter be a good enough reason to look away. Emily set the documents down on the table gently, like she was trying not to disturb something fragile. "I need to understand all of it," she said. "Everything. Not just what you're telling me." My father didn't respond right away. He looked for the first time since I'd walked in less like a man defending himself and more like a man realizing the story he'd built for so long no longer held together under the weight of the truth sitting on his own coffee table. Nobody moved to leave. The documents were still spread across the coffee table and my father was still standing near the window with his arms crossed, but something in the room had shifted from confrontation into something closer to reckoning. Emily was the one who finally asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the night she first called me crying, asking what I'd done. "Why were you so afraid of that photo?" she asked. "It's not even about the estate. What was it actually about, Dad?" I answered before he could, because by then I understood it better than he probably wanted to admit out loud. "The photo wasn't the problem," I said. I kept my eyes on him while I spoke. "General Whitmore wasn't going to swoop in and fix anything. He's not part of this. He's just a man I saluted at a ceremony." My father didn't look at me. He was staring at the folder on the table like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he waited long enough. "The problem," I continued, "was that you finally saw me standing somewhere you never expected me to reach, and you couldn't control the story anymore. For years, my father's version of me had been carefully maintained. Difficult, stubborn, chose the army over the family. A daughter who didn't fit neatly into the shape he'd built for what a Caldwell woman was supposed to be. That version worked fine, as long as it stayed inside our house, repeated at dinner tables and holiday gatherings, where nobody outside the family had reason to question it. But a photograph doesn't ask permission to exist. It doesn't wait for a narrative to be arranged around it first. It simply shows what's true, and what that photo showed was a woman in uniform, a major standing beside a general who clearly respected her in a moment that had nothing to do with rebellion or difficulty. It showed competence. It showed a life he hadn't authored and couldn't take credit for. "He's known Grandpa's name for years," I added, because I'd done enough digging to understand this part too. "Not through me, through some old veterans organization you were both connected to a long time ago. Records from a fund Grandpa used to support. That's the extent of the connection. It was never about me showing off. It was a coincidence you couldn't stand." My father finally looked up. For a moment I thought he might deny it, might reach for another accusation to throw across the room. Instead, something in him seemed to give out like a structure that had been under quiet pressure for longer than anyone realized. "I needed one day," he said, "where nobody questioned me." The room went very still. "That's why you didn't want me at the wedding," I said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was never about the guest list. He didn't answer directly, but he didn't need to. Emily was watching him now with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, somewhere between grief and clarity. The look of someone realizing that the version of their father they'd trusted their whole life had been curated as carefully as anything in that folder. "You were going to ask questions," I said. "About the fund, about Grandpa's will, about where the money actually went. You couldn't risk that happening in front of everyone you'd invited, so instead of being honest with me, you erased me from the day, and then told people I'd chosen not to come." "I never wanted it to go this far," he said. And for the first time his voice had lost its edge, had become something quieter, almost tired. "I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting Emily, giving her something you didn't need." "You didn't get to decide what I needed," I said. "You just decided it was easier not to ask." Margaret spoke up then from the doorway, her voice small but steady. "I should have said something years ago. I told myself staying quiet kept the peace. It didn't. It just meant one of my daughters carried all the weight of what the other one never had to think about." My father didn't respond to her either. He sat down slowly in the chair by the window, the folder still on the table in front of him, and for a long moment nobody spoke. I watched something settle over him that looked less like anger now, and more like exhaustion. The particular fatigue of a man who has spent years managing a story so carefully that he'd forgotten how to exist without one. "You didn't need a perfect wedding," I said finally. "You needed a room where no one knew the truth." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself again. He just sat there in the quiet while the four of us stood around him holding a version of the truth he could no longer rearrange in his favor. Emily reached over and picked up the unsigned transfer document, the one dated for a window that had already passed, the one that would have moved even more money out of a fund that was never his to move alone. "This isn't happening," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Not like this. Not anymore. I didn't want revenge. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy in the weeks that followed to let this become something ugly, something built on punishment instead of correction. That's not who I am. And honestly, it's not who my father raised me to be either, even if he'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth handled the way truth should be handled, through the proper channels with documentation and accountability, not through anger dressed up as justice. The attorney I'd hired filed a formal request for an accounting of the family fund. My father, faced with the paperwork Emily and I had already assembled, didn't fight it. I think some part of him understood that the story had already changed shape too much to be pulled back together. The pending transfer was frozen before it could execute. An independent audit was ordered on the fund's history going back to the year it was created. It would take months to fully untangle, but the unsigned document that would have moved the largest sum yet never got a signature. That much at least was stopped in time. Emily wasn't asked to return the money that had gone toward her house. That part had already happened, already been folded into a life she and David were building together, and unwinding it wouldn't have repaired anything. But she had to sit with a harder truth than a repayment schedule. She had to accept that she'd benefited quietly and without asking questions from a system that had decided I didn't need what was legally mine. That's not a comfortable thing to carry. I watched her carry it anyway without flinching away from it, which told me more about who my sister actually was than anything that had happened before. She called me a week after the family meeting. Her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. "I should have asked you," she said. "About everything. I never once asked what you were owed or what you'd lost or why you weren't at the table more. I just accepted what I was given and didn't look too closely at where it came from." "Yes," I said. "Not 'it's okay,' not 'don't worry about it,' because some wounds don't need to be smoothed over to be forgiven. They need to be named honestly first." My mother apologized too in her own quieter way over coffee one afternoon a few weeks later. She didn't try to explain away her silence. She just said she was sorry for choosing peace over honesty for so many years, and that she understood now that the peace had never really existed. It had just been quiet on the surface while someone underneath it went unheard. My father lost control of the fund. The court appointed an independent trustee to manage what remained of my grandfather's estate, splitting it finally the way it had always been intended, equally between his granddaughters. Richard Caldwell is still my father. That part doesn't change, and I never wanted it to. But he no longer gets to decide quietly and from a distance who deserves a seat at the table and who doesn't. I went back to base. Life resumed its rhythm, the one I'd built for myself long before any of this started: briefings and deployments and the particular comfort of routines that don't depend on anyone else's approval. But something had shifted between Emily and me that didn't go back to how it used to be. We talked more. Actual conversations, not just holiday small talk performed for an audience. We were building something new without our father standing in the middle of it, deciding who got called the difficult one and who got called the golden child. A year later, I came home for Thanksgiving. Emily opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for my car. She hugged me the way she used to when we were kids, tight and unguarded, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. Inside, the table was set the way it always was, except for one thing: an empty chair right where my father usually sat. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He said he wasn't coming," Emily said. I looked at that empty chair for a long moment. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected years earlier if you'd told me this was how things would end up. I just felt the quiet, uncomplicated truth of it. Things had changed. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly, which was more than we'd ever had before. "I wish things had been different," Emily said. "So do I told her. Then after a moment, "But different starts with telling the truth." My father thought he could decide who belonged at the table. For years I believed him. Then one day I understood something I wish I'd known much sooner. Being left off a guest list doesn't mean you're unwanted. Sometimes it means the people already seated are afraid of what you'll say when you finally sit down. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below and let me know which part hit you hardest. We share stories like this every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for sitting with Madison's story today. Let's keep this journey going together.